Okay, folks, welcome to the Otherppl Show, a weekly podcast featuring in-depth conversations with today's leading writers. I am Brad Listi, and I'm in Los Angeles. This is a books and culture show, and I have a great episode for you today. My guest is Carla Kaplan, and she is the author of a new biography of Jessica Mitford. It is called Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. It is available from Harper, and it has recently been longlisted for both the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Penn Jacqueline Bogard Weld Award for biography. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, Jessica Mitford, known by her friends and family as Decca Mitford, was the fifth of six Mitford girls. The Mitfords were an aristocratic British family, kind of a proto-Kardashian family. It's a little bit of a crude comparison, but it kind of gives you an idea. She was born in the early 20th century. She ended up moving to America, coming from this British aristocracy. She moved to the United States and became an avowed communist, a civil rights activist, and eventually a very successful journalist and author who helped to revive the great muckraking tradition in American journalism. She wrote a very successful book called The American Way of Death that changed the American funeral industry and led to the passage of laws and consumer protections. And in a larger literary sense, her work helped to pave the way for the new journalists who followed in her wake. So a big life and a very interesting life, especially when you countenance Decca Mitford's life against the lives of her many sisters. And I'm not going to describe those lives here. I'm going to let the conversation that I have with Carla Kaplan do that work. But suffice it to say, it's incredibly fascinating, incredibly divergent paths taken by the six Mitford sisters. And I just had a delightful conversation with Carla Kaplan. You're going to hear that in just a moment. And before I forget, please be sure to subscribe to this show wherever you listen. Hit the subscribe button, and you can follow me on social media. I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky. I also have a weekly email newsletter, just like everybody else. You can sign up for my weekly newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. I will let you know about the latest episodes of this show each week. I also share a list of links to things that I've been reading and finding interesting. So if that sounds good, go sign up for my newsletter at bradlisti.substack.com. And otherwise, it's almost over, 2025. It's winding down. And this is one of the final new episodes that you will hear from me this year. I'm not entirely sure how the last days of 2025 are going to go for this podcast. There's this episode, and then on Tuesday, I think I'm going to do my year-end episode where I kind of wrap things up. I talk about what has happened this year on the show, and I kind of run down maybe the most listened to episodes. Though there's always like an asterisk, because the episodes that aired back in, say, January of 2025 have obviously had more time to accrue listeners, so I never quite know how to do the math. It doesn't feel fair to the episodes that, went live in, say, October and November. They haven't had as much time to find audience, but I'll kind of run down some of the most popular episodes of the year. I'll sum things up, and then that'll be that for new episodes this year. And then I think what I'm going to do in the remaining days of 2025 between, say, Tuesday and 2026 is just to kind of play some reruns. I'll be playing some episodes that aired earlier in the year that were a big hit with listeners. So that, I think, is what's going to happen in the days ahead. And then I will be back in the new year with a regular slate. And otherwise, I'm just doing the holiday stuff. I actually had to go before I talked with Carla Kaplan, I had to race over to my son's school. They were doing their holiday sing, where the kids get up in front of the parents and they sing holiday songs, basically. It's very cute. It happens every year. I feel like I'm always racing there. and trying to make sure I catch it. And so I did that. And then, just kind of watching, like every parent watches their kid, and like your heart sort of leaps out of your chest at these things, right? You're seeing your child up on stage singing. It's very adorable. But like with my son who has disabilities, he's got like, he's neuroatypical. When he gets up in front of the school, essentially in front of an audience, and he's with the group, and, he's got some physical disabilities, so he's got to go up these steps, and then he stands at the top of these steps for the performance. And so I'm always like, oh, Jesus, like, don't fall. Like, that's kind of what I'm thinking. There's always a little bit of that. And then he's got to like hit his lines. He's got to like sing the song. And it was a bit of a mixed bag. They sang, his class did. His class was assigned the George Michael song, Last Christmas. You guys know that song, right? Last Christmas, I gave you my heart. Like, it's a good song, actually, insofar as like a holiday song can be a good song. It's one of the least offensive, I think, holiday songs, at least for me. So that was the song that they did. And he's been practicing the words, like not only with his class, but at home. He would be like listening to it and trying to like memorize the words. It's not super easy for him, but he was doing it. And then I guess like his teacher assigned him the closing moment of the performance where he had to be the one to step up to the microphone and say Merry Christmas. And, it's a fairly simple task, right? But, for him, I'm like, is he going to do it? Is he going to say it? Is he going to say it loud enough for people to understand him? He can get a little shy. And I was worried that he would either forget or he would just say it and it would be like a mumble. But he did it. He nailed it. It was great. It was good. It was good for him. He had, it was a little touch and go during the singing. It was sort of like, have you ever seen that video of Bob Dylan in the We Are the World taping where he's kind of like rocking back and forth and mumbling? Like either definitely doesn't want to be there and might not even know the words, but he just looks disgusted. And, in Bob Dylan's case anyway, I think he looked medicated. I don't know what he was on, but it was something and it was good. But it was a little bit of that with my son this morning during the singing of Last Christmas. He was not, obviously high or anything like that, but he was doing some rocking and some mumbling as the other kids were perhaps more animated and enthused. But that's all right. It's all right. It's not for everybody. So that happened, and then I'm just trying to scramble to get gifts. And I ended up, my daughter has been pining to go see Olivia Dean, who I did not know who Olivia Dean was until like a few days ago. And now I'm such a fan of this young woman, this singer. She's such a light. I can't get over how much everybody likes this song, apparently, that she's got out. What is it called? I'm going to forget now that I'm talking about it. The Man I Need. Is that what it's called? It's her big hit. And for good reason, it's a big hit. It's got this kind of throwback feel, a little bit of Motown, a little bit of Diana Ross. There's something classic about her. And she's just got such good positive energy. It feels like a tonic. There was this performance that I'm on Instagram, like flicking through these videos because my daughter was like, I really want to go. There's no tickets. And so I broke down. I was like, okay, tickets are absurd. But my daughter's going to be turning 16. The concert isn't until next summer. But I was like, this would be a winning. Like, this is a way for me as a dad to win and to be like remembered as a good father. To be remembered fondly. Oh, there was that Christmas where my dad gave me tickets to the Olivia Dean concert. I hope my daughter doesn't listen to this show. I don't think she does. Nobody in my family, except maybe my parents, listen to this show. So I'm not going to be spoiling anything. But I got the tickets. I don't know if I'm going to go to the show. I kind of feel like my wife would enjoy it more than I would, or that, I don't know. I kind of want them to go. Maybe I'll go. It'll be like a father-daughter thing. But the truth is that my wife like really loves to go to these concerts. And so maybe that's what it'll be. But my daughter will be going to see Olivia Dean. I'm kind of jealous if I don't get to go. Sure, it'll be good. So that's it. And then I'm just trying to kind of wind down the podcast for the year. I want to make sure that there are episodes so that you can listen when you're traveling or, like I always say at the holidays, you're either traveling, you're stuck at the airport, or you're trying to avoid your family. These are the instances in which podcasts are very user-friendly. So I'll try to make sure you guys have stuff to listen to, and then we'll get back to it in 2026. Don't forget about my company, Deep Dive. It's a learning platform that creates in-depth writing courses, and there's a big holiday sale that is rolling right now. You can save 30% on everything, all courses and bundles, over at www.deepdive.audio. The coupon code is holidays2025. And if you want to send a gift, this is the perfect, meaningful gift, either to yourself or to a writer in your life. One of these courses or multiple courses, it's a great gift. And if you want to send it as a gift, it's also an extremely easy way to give somebody something great. You just select send as a gift at checkout, and you can schedule delivery to their inbox anytime. So there's no shipping. There's none of that. It's logistically user-friendly. It's an easy way to give a great gift. So check it out at deepdive.audio. All right. So I think that's it for preliminaries, and we'll get to the main event. My conversation with Carla Kaplan, author of Troublemaker, The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford. It is available from Harper. Carla is a professor at Northeastern University. She is the author of 7 books, including Zora Neale Hurston, A Life in Letters, and Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance. Both were New York Times notable books. And I just had an absolutely delightful time talking with her. It's a fascinating book that she has written about a woman and a family that I did not know all that much about when I was going into this. But I read about the book, and I read about Decca and the fact that she became a communist and a civil rights activist and a muckraker, despite the fact that she was born into the British aristocracy. That's fascinating. And on its own, it's fascinating, but it is also a story that has a lot of useful resonances to the present day. A woman who was operating in very tumultuous political times, who was a traitor to her class, and who was doing the hard but necessary work of political activism and muckraking journalism. It's inspiring. And somebody who was very resilient and who had several distinct acts in her life. She did lots of different things, and she did them well. And she, in her way, sets an example for the rest of us. And I think you're going to find this conversation very interesting. And I hope you enjoyed as much as I did. So let's get to it. Here I am talking with Carla Kaplan, and her new book, one more time, is called Troublemaker.
So the Mitford family were British aristocrats who lived in the Cotswolds, and they were very, very land rich, talking over 20,000 acres of land all over England, and fairly cash poor. They were a baron and a baroness, and they were extremely well known for being highly eccentric and highly insular. Now, being eccentric in the British aristocracy is not necessarily original. There's a lot of eccentricity in the British aristocracy. But even in that context, the parents of the Mitford sisters were eccentric by absolutely any measure. The father, David Mitford, Baron Mitford, wore exactly the same outfit every single day, called all of the young men his daughters brought anywhere near the house damn sewers, believed that everything outside the house was a horror and referred to everything outside their manor house with a capital E as elsewhere. Their mother had an even more eccentric background than their father. She lost her own mother when she was only 8 years old. She was raised by a father who had absolutely no conception of parenting and took his children on a yacht sailing for over a year that they barely survived. She had responsibility for all of her siblings. And these two parents had 7 children, 6 daughters and 1 son. We're not going to talk about the son very much. His name was Tom. He was everybody's darling. He got everything. He got to go to school, and he was unfortunately killed in World War II. The real focus of the family, and the reason they have become so famous and remain very famous to this day, are the 6 sisters. So the 6 sisters were known in their day as the Mitford girls. They have become legendary for their beauty, their brilliance, their creativity, and also for the life choices that they made, some of which were very, very unfortunate. So they were born aristocratic beauties into a family that didn't believe in education for girls and into a class that didn't believe in education for women. And all of these 6 young women were raised to marry well and perpetuate their class. That was their role in life. And all of these Mitford girls were completely uninterested in fulfilling that mission alone. They all wanted a bigger life. They all had bigger ideas for what they could be and do in the world, but they had no outlets. So absolutely no education and very little interaction with the outside world. The British aristocracy is always insular, and the Mitford family was unusually so.
So why so insular? That's so fascinating to me. I know, like, as a product of their times, young girls were not afforded the same opportunities as, the boys were, and that, the prospects for their future were circumscribed in many ways. But this idea of a family that is so privileged being so terrified, it seems, of the outside world. And that's common, or that was common. Maybe it continues to be common among the aristocracy. Can you talk a little bit more about what fueled this? Like, were these people paranoid?
So to us, to moderns, and to Americans especially, it looks like terrified. What I came to understand in my research for this book, which took me 10 years, was that it was less terror and more disinterest. So the British aristocracy has always maintained itself by insularity. It's always maintained itself by self-referentiality. It turns to itself, it marries itself, it socializes with itself, and it gets its opinions and its ideas from itself. And that is how the British aristocracy maintains itself over generations and generations and generations. And some people might say that the really wealthy class in the United States is perhaps no different, or not much different. The wealthiest class in the United States, the children seem to go to the same boarding schools. They vacation in the same spots. They tend to marry one another. So there is a very typical insularity for the upper classes. And in British aristocratic heritage, that is reinforced, and that is actually a protocol of the class. So one of the reasons the 2 volumes that explain the peerage and the who's who of British nobility are prominently out in the library of British aristocratic homes is to maintain that insularity, to maintain that closed society. Very elite classes have to involve a great deal of gatekeeping. If you let everybody in, you don't have an elite class anymore. And the British aristocracy is all about gatekeeping. And Jessica Mitford's family was very much part of that tradition. So the two parents really came from the same kind of background.
So yeah, you had David, and then you had Sidney Bowles, the mother.
That's
who,
right.
I believe her father founded, among other things, he founded Vanity Fair.
He founded Vanity Fair and the Lady magazine. That's exactly right.
And so you had this gaggle of children. I think it was, 5 girls and one boy?
6 girls and 1 boy.
6 girls and 1 boy. Let me try to get the girls. Nancy,
Good. Yes.
Pam,
yes.
Diana, Unity, Jessica or Decca, who is the focus of your book, and Deborah or Debo Mitford.
Oh, you get an A.
Yeah. I have this written down, so I'm cheating. But these are, and this is maybe not a comparison you're fond of, but I think even in some reviews, people have sort of made the Kardashian comparison.
Absolutely.
There's something kind of like proto-Kardashian about the Mitfords, at least insofar as the culture took an interest in them, and maybe just because of the sheer number of them. But a bunch of beauties, a lot, a very sophisticated lot. But like you said, a kind of insular lot. They really only had each other growing up. And so there were nicknames and private languages and a real closeness and intimacy and kind of what you would expect from children who are growing up in this manner. Very privileged, but very isolated in the country, in the Cotswolds, lots of natural beauty, lots of outdoor time. The family was kind of also ahead of its time in terms of natural foods and health. There's a lot of talk about relying on nature and fresh air rather than going to see like Western doctors or whatever. And
no medicines. All prescriptions are immediately flushed down the drain.
That's all right. That stuff. But, what's really fascinating, and I think what has kind of kept the Mitford industry, as people sort of joke about it, going, is the fact that they all took such divergent paths, or there are so many different iterations of a Mitford girl as she matured. And you've got, Unity, who was like an Adolf Hitler fangirl.
Oh, she was more than a fangirl.
But literally started that way, went to Germany, was basically stalking the guy, and then became one of his intimates.
Yes, and there's a lot of debate over how we should understand intimate. We know that they were alone together hundreds of times, and when war was declared, Unity, who had always said she would do this if war was declared, she went into a park in Germany. She sat down on a park bench. She took a tiny little pistol out of her big handbag. She put it up to her temple, and she pulled the trigger. And she didn't die. She actually lived for about 8 more years with the bullet lodged in the back of her brain and at the back of her skull with very diminished capacities. So she was very, very close to Hitler. He immediately took care of her, got her sent to a hospital in Switzerland, paid all her expenses, looked after all her medical care, came to Switzerland at least once to see her. She was not conscious at the time. So what's remarkable about all of the Mitford girls, and you've already sort of mentioned this, is how much they both turn only to one another to realize lives for themselves, and how much they're pulling these lives out of complete thin air. So it's very hard for Americans to imagine the way these girls grew up, how cosseted they were, and how thrown back only on one another they were. But what we have to imagine are these villages in the Cotswolds that extend for miles and miles. And at the apex of the village is the noble family that owns the manor. So in this case, it's the Mitford family. And everybody descending down from that family works for the family. They may run the power plant that David has engineered at the back of the house. They may be the gardeners. They may run the inn that the family also owns. They may run the farm that the family also owns. So there's the family. And then for acres and acres and acres and acres, there are people who work for the family. And it is not appropriate for aristocrats to socialize in any way with non-aristocrats. So there is nobody in the immediate surrounding with whom it is appropriate for the girls to socialize except one another. So they are, to an unusual extent, thrown back on one another, and they create an entire world, as you mentioned, of private languages and jokes and teases and games and costumes and plays and storytelling with one another. And they encourage one another. And every single one of them reaches up into thin air and pulls down an imaginary future for themselves. Unity's was to be Hitler's intimate, and she achieves that with more success than anybody would have imagined. But what's incredible...
And I just want to interrupt because there are some strange coincidences that, it just caught my eye. I think maybe even you make note of the fact that wasn't Unity born in a town in Canada called Swastika?
She was.
And wasn't her, and her middle name is Valkyrie. And wasn't there like a military operation to kill Hitler called Valkyrie?
It is. And her name was Unity Valkyrie Mitford, and she was born in Swastika, and you can't make this stuff up. It's what makes them so amazing. So should I run through them all with their imaginary futures?
Well, here's what I'll do, just to make myself feel special. I will encapsulate a Mitford girl, and then you can elaborate.
Excellent.
So we'll start with Nancy, who I believe is the eldest.
Yep.
And she was a very popular novelist in her day. She published very popular novels, including The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. She was also a biographer.
Yep.
And was married and divorced, I believe, and then wound up marrying a French politician or having a relationship with a French politician.
Yes, not marrying, to her great distress. The not marrying is a really important piece of this story. He refused to marry her.
Okay.
And it was a source of terrible pain for her.
So, it's always hard to achieve literary success, to make one's name in the world of letters and to publish books and make a living from it. She managed to do it. Mm-hmm. There was then Pamela or Pam Mitford, who was known as the quote unquote rural Mitford.
Yes. Her nickname was Woman.
Okay. And she lived in the country, I would take it, right?
Yes.
And ended up, I think she was a lesbian, right?
She was, and she was the only one to keep her name out of the press. All the other Mitfords were famous for being themselves, which is really the parallel to the Kardashians. They were famous for being themselves and being beautiful. They achieved much more in the outer world than I think we would say the Kardashians have done. So in that way, they're different, but they were very similar in that they were famous for being famous, except for Pamela, the only lesbian in the group who very much kept her life out of the press. So she was a farmer and a country woman, had horses and chickens and dogs, was the only one who wasn't a very public figure.
We then have among the sisters, Diana, who was the great beauty of the family, I think is the way she's often characterized. She was, kind of like this classic beauty and was beautiful into her old age. She's one of these people who just aged like a fine wine and sort of always looked elegant and beautiful, but problematic politics here as well.
Yes, problematic is a kind word, I would have to say. Diana, who married very young, she married Brian Guinness, heir to the Guinness liquor fortune, had 2 sons, an entirely proper aristocratic marriage to a man of her own circle and of her own class with more money than her family had. So a little bit scandalous because she married so very young. She was barely 19 when she married Guinness. But then she did an incredibly scandalous thing for her time, and she left him and she left her children to take up with Oswald Mosley, who was the head of the British Union of Fascists. And when Diana left Guinness for Mosley, Mosley was not only married, he was carrying on 2 very known affairs with 2 of his wife's sisters. And this is the man for whom Diana left her husband. She lived, eventually the wife died. He married Diana. They married in Goebbels' backyard with Hitler in attendance.
Joseph Goebbels,
with Hitler in attendance. And Diana lived all her life as a completely unrepentant fascist. She went to her grave, beautiful, statuesque, Romanesque, gorgeous, refusing ever to apologize for her fascist politics, and actually insisting that 6 million people couldn't possibly have been killed in the Holocaust. And in any case, according to her, whatever happened was the fault of the Jews. And she was quite public with all of these views. She spent some of the World War II with Oswald Mosley in Holloway Prison. They were imprisoned as traitors to England after the war. And she was entirely complacent about these extreme right-wing politics. She was the only one with whom Jessica, Decca, refused ever to have any contact after Jessica left.
So we next have Unity, who we've already touched on. She was the one who
That's right.
was in love with Hitler, went over to Germany, was his intimate, and was hanging out with him, and then got so swept up in the Nazi thing that when Britain declared war against Germany, she shot herself.
That's right.
And I just want to pause here because that's crazy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering what your take would be. Did she just have a screw loose to begin with? Or when she was hanging out in Germany and was amid all of these people who were so ideological and kind of twisted and, caught up in the Nazi thing, that she got caught up in it too and just took it to an extreme? How do you make sense of what she did?
So Unity was always the most extreme of all the girls. So Unity always took everything 2 steps further than everybody else. And she loved being notorious even before she went to Germany. So everybody, all of the girls disdained the debutante balls that they had to go through. And they all made fun of the coming out protocols that they had to endure, which involved everything from being presented to the Queen at court, who they always made fun of behind her back, to going to these debutante balls and dancing with what they called the chinless wonders of all the young men from the neighborhood. And they all were kind of snarky, I think we would say, about these protocols. But Unity always took it further, and she would attend the balls with one of her 2 favorite pets. Either she had her pet rat on her shoulder, or and his name was Ratula, or she had her pet snake named Enid wrapped around her neck. So it was her FU at society. And Unity was always displaying her difference. There's a lot of speculation now, 100 years later. Might Unity have been slightly bipolar? She could seem manic to people. We don't know. Those diagnoses didn't exist. They especially didn't exist among the aristocracy, which makes a lot of room for eccentric behavior. And Unity loved being an eccentric. One of the things that Jessica, Decca, loved about her family is that they tended to be extreme and they tended to be bold. She had a phrase she used in positive terms about her family. She called them all terrific haters. And what she meant by that is that they didn't prevaricate, they didn't waver. When they had a view, they went all the way with it. And she admired this about the family. And nobody was more of a terrific hater than Unity. Now, Decca hated the kinds of things that Unity hated. She, of course, abhorred and hated Unity's fervent anti-Semitism, but she admired Unity's consistency of commitment. And however we understand Unity putting that gun to her head and trying to kill herself, it was something that was not out of the realm of Mitford behavior. They were extreme people who, once they made a commitment, tended to stick with it. And Unity, we have to remember, at that moment, was completely trapped between her loyalty to England and her wild infatuation with Hitler. She did not see a path out for herself other than suicide. And she had always been fascinated with the idea of suicide. Even as a young girl, she used to talk to Decca about committing suicide. And they had an expression for it. They had an expression for everything. There was nothing they didn't have a phrase for, but their expression for committing suicide was COMMIDIT, committed. Committed meant to commit suicide. And they always had a kind of macabre fascination with that idea. So within the context of the terrific haters of the Mitford world, what Unity did makes a kind of personality sense. I'm not saying it isn't crazy. Of course it's crazy, but it is consistent.
Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead in order of birth, and I'm going to talk about Deborah, and then we're going to go back and we're going to talk about Decca because she's the focus of your book. But Debo is the youngest Mitford girl. Nickname was Nine, which I suppose was like, there was a kind of a tease. It was like supposedly her mental age.
That's right.
But she had a kind of, it seems like she had a somewhat conventional aristocratic life compared to, say, Decca.
She couldn't have actually had a more conventional aristocratic life. Debo is the great aristocratic success. So like all of her sisters, she reaches up into thin air to pull down a future for herself. You know, Nancy says she's going to be a writer. Unity says she's going to be a Nazi. And Debo says, I'm going to be a duchess. Now, there's no obvious path for this, but she decides as a young girl, she's going to be a duchess. She almost gets it wrong. She marries not the first son, but she marries the second son of one of the great dukedoms of England. The first son is also a really interesting figure. This is Billy Hartington, who married Kathleen Kennedy, known as Kick Kennedy. And for your listeners who have some vague memory of hearing that there was a Kennedy who was a duchess, that was Kick Kennedy. And Billy Hartington was killed in the war, and Kick Kennedy was killed in a plane crash very soon thereafter. And all of a sudden, Debo's husband, Andrew Cavendish, who was second in line to the dukedom, now becomes the Duke of Devonshire. And that makes Debo the Duchess of Devonshire and the chatelaine of Chatsworth House, which is one of the grandest, most enormous, most venerated estates in all of England. And there are levels of dukedom. And in the levels of dukedom, the dukedom of Devonshire is at the absolute top. So now she is not only a duchess, she is the Duchess of Devonshire. She runs Chatsworth House, and she achieves the sort of aristocratic dream.
Okay. So that brings us to Decca, who again is, she's the main event in your book. And I guess just describe who she was and who she became in a nutshell, and then we'll get into it.
So Decca, who is the second youngest of this, what they were called a tribe, which I think is very right, this tribe of young women, this tribe of 6 sisters, like her sisters, was brilliant and creative and full of energy and had no outlet. She was particularly interested in going to school. She actually had a fantasy early on that she wanted to be a scientist, and she was furious that nobody would let her go to school and study science. But at 14, she really learns about socialism, mostly from reading the newspapers, and she writes away for socialist literature. So she uses her little allowance to write away for as much socialist literature as she can get. And alone among her sisters, as far as we can tell, only Decca had a really profound, even childhood sense of social fairness. So I think we've all either been children with a really profound sense of fairness, or we've been around children with a really profound sense of fairness. That child who can't walk past a homeless person, the child who is infuriated if allowances are not exactly even across the board. Decca was that child. She noticed the poverty of the villagers, and it upset her terribly. She was aware that her class, that the aristocracy had more than everybody else, and that everybody else had very little. This always seemed strange to her. She couldn't understand it. And she never lost that sense of social fairness. Some children have it and lose it. she never lost it, and she developed it. So she started reading about socialism at 14. She reached up in the air and declared that she would become a communist, as one sister declared she'd be a fascist, and another sister declared she'd be a Nazi, and another sister declared she'd be a duchess. Decca said, I'm going to be a communist. And at 19, she ran away with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, to fight in the Spanish Civil War and to get away from her aristocratic background, a world that everybody else coveted, everybody else wanted to get into, and she referred to as that dread place. And she ran away at 19. She actually had been saving up to run away for years. When she was only 11 years old, she went to Drummond's Bank and she opened something she called her running away account. And every time she got a little bit of extra money, she put it in her running away account. And she was able to utilize that at 19 to run away with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly.
Okay, so something about Decca that occurs to me is that of all the siblings, all the sisters, and the paths that they took, hers is the most unlikely.
Oh, yeah.
I feel like for a British aristocrat living in this kind of insulated world of hyperprivilege to become a fascist, I don't know. I mean, I can see the line. You know, maybe that's unfair, but I sort of makes some sense to me. For a British aristocrat being raised on, you know, however many thousands of acres in the Cotswolds to become an avowed communist and a muckraker in the United States and a kind of, you know, just a very dedicated proponent of civil rights, a fighter for civil rights and for economic justice. It's just so unlikely. And, you know, I wonder how people's politics form. This is like kind of an eternal mystery for me. Some people seem to be wired to be hyper-conservative. Some people seem wired to be hyper-liberal. Is it that, I wonder? Is it nature or is it nurture? Or, you know, how do you make sense of how this stuff happens?
I think that the thing I love most about Jessica Mitford is how unlikely her story is and how completely naturally and authentically she lives that unlikeliness all her life. Because while there were other people, there have always been people who walk away from wealth and privilege. We can look in any society and find somebody who turns their back on wealth and privilege and comfort. It is not usual. And what makes her really exceptional is not just that she walks away from wealth, privilege, status, comfort, but that she becomes such a remarkably successful advocate for other people. And she has to learn to do that. So let's face it, the aristocracy is not famous either for its interest in other people or its empathy for other sectors of society. And Jessica Mitford runs away from that disinterestedness. She's a deeply interested person. And she can't be satisfied with this closed, insular, cosseted world. And she uses the running away to educate herself about how to advocate for other people. And that includes how to care about them. She has to learn, what does it mean to actually care about other people without just condescending to them? And she both makes remarkable choices and has remarkable luck. So she runs away with her second cousin, Esmond Romilly, who was already a famous rebel. He has already run away. He is also a product of the British aristocracy. He's Winston Churchill's nephew. And he's already famous for running away from boarding school. And he's a published author by the time he is 16 years old. His first book, Out of Bounds, which is about running away from boarding school, Wellington, comes out when he's only 16 years old. And he's famous for living on the streets and being a rebel and being kind of a wild man of the aristocracy, but a communist and a socialist. And when she meets him, so she's known about him all her life. She's sort of half in love with him before she meets him. He is a second cousin, but she's never met him. At the point at which she meets Esmond, He has just returned from fighting in the Spanish Civil War. And he was one of the youngest and earliest English volunteers to fight in that war. He actually got to Spain so early that there wasn't yet an English volunteer brigade. He had to join up.
And I just want to interrupt because I think it's useful historical context to people listening in the present day to have like a full understanding of what the Spanish Civil War meant to young people. Like there's a corollary drawn to the present day. I'm forgetting exactly what it is. Is it just like the struggle for?
Well, some people draw the corollary to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, the Freedom Riders.
Right.
That's a corollary I've also drawn because the lesson of the Spanish Civil War was a lesson not just in an abstract notion of solidarity, but in what it meant to really put your life on the line for the struggles of other people. Because the thing that and for the progressives of the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War was everything. It was the watershed. It was the complete life lesson. And that was very much true for Decca.
So like progressives the world over, not just progressives in Spain.
No, progressives the world over, because what was remarkable about the struggle in Spain was that globally, people volunteered from all around the world to try to defend the Spanish Republic, the democratically elected Spanish Republic, against a fascist takeover. And people globally were so horrified by the fascist takeover of a democratically elected government that they put their bodies on the line as fighters to fight the fascists. And that was the beginning of the international brigades, or the volunteer brigades as they've become known. And it was a signal moment in global history, a signal moment in world history when people came from all over the place willing to die for principle. And Esmond Romilly had been one of those young men. He had been, and they weren't only young men, there were women as well. They were mostly young men. And he had gone so early that he joined up with an Italian and a German battalion. And he fought some of the bloodiest battles of Spain, some of the worst battles of Madrid and Boadilla. And he ended up as one of only a very few, a tiny handful of survivors of his battalion. And he also contracted life-threatening dysentery. He was really at death's door. So he was invalided back to England to recover from dysentery, and he did. And then he had the dismal job of traveling all over the English countryside to tell the families of volunteer brigade members how their loved ones had died on the battlefield. So he did that. And then he went to a cousin's to kind of recover both emotionally and physically from all of that. And it was at that cousin's that he met Jessica Mitford. And she finally got to meet this heroic cousin of hers. And she leaned into him at dinner and she whispered, "Will you take me to Spain?" Because he intended to go back as soon as he was well. And he said yes. And they left not long afterwards. They fell in love within about 24 hours. They were a couple within 3 days. And it was in Spain that Jessica Mitford got her real lessons of what it meant to actually put yourself on the line for other people. And she met all kinds of members of the volunteer brigades. She also met other aristocrats who had left their class background, including a woman named Constancia de la Mora, who was a famous, at the time, she's unheard of now, but she was a famous Spanish aristocrat who gave everything up to fight for the Republic, to fight for Spain. And Decca later named her daughter Constancia in honor of that. And it was an incredible life lesson for her to learn from people like Esmond, who risked his life, to learn from people like Constancia, who threw away wealth and privilege and power and status. And those were life lessons, like most people who went to Spain to fight it for the Republic. Those were lessons that stayed with Jessica Mitford all her life and made her so distant from her family within a period of months. So she went from this cosseted, privileged world to a world in which people were dying for principle. And it changed her very deeply.
Yeah, how could it not? And, I want to talk about tragedy. I mean, we can't get to all the different episodes in the relationship between Decca and Esmond, but, they have this relationship. They end up having a daughter named Julia, and Julia dies of measles, I think at, 6 months of age?
Barely 6 months, yeah.
I mean, just
tragic.
Decca's life was not unmarked by tragedy, to say the least, but this was the first one. And this was also, at least insofar as I came to understand it in your book, the first real demonstration of what would later be described as Decca's concrete upper lip. We talk about like the stiff upper lip of the British and the way that they're not demonstratively emotional. And certainly she is of the class and of the generation where that was the case. It's kind of remarkable to me the way that this woman could compartmentalize in her life, because she had such an ebullient, cheerful, kind of undefeated demeanor, at least public facing, that she was able to maintain even in the face of terrible loss. And I want to also make note of the fact that she had Julia and then subsequently lost Julia when she was just a child herself. She was so
That's
young.
right.
I mean, this was also a generational issue, but what was she, 20 years old when she had Julia?
She was slightly older, but not by much. I mean, and it was a horrifying tragedy for her. It was also a class story in many ways. So when Julia contracted measles and died, Jessica and Esmond had briefly returned to London after Spain. They had briefly returned to working class London. And Decca was very principled about not leaning on her family in the way she might have. She didn't go to them and say, hire me a nanny, hire me a governess, give me money for the best medical care available. She went to the local working class health clinic in their working class London neighborhood. And she didn't announce her background. It might have been detectable in her accent. She had a very upper crust accent. But she didn't announce it to the local nurses, the healthcare nurses. And they assumed, as anybody would, that she had had lots of exposure to other children with measles as a child, and that she probably had some natural inoculation to measles. What the healthcare nurses couldn't have known is, as a British aristocrat raised in such an insular family, she had had almost no exposure to other children except her own sisters. So she had no natural immunity to measles. So when she got it, she got completely slammed with it. She nearly died. When her daughter got it, her daughter got the worst possible case of measles and did not survive. And some of that came from a misunderstanding about the insularity of Decca's background. And that was a piece of that tragedy, that her refusal to lean on class privilege, her refusal to even announce her class background, contributed in a complicated way to the severity of her measles. It was part of the way in which she paid her dues. And I'm not saying they were always smart dues to pay. Maybe that wasn't a really good example of paying her dues. But she did pay her dues all her life. She was somebody who, on the one hand, was perfectly willing to use aspects of her background to her advantage. Over all the years of her life in Oakland, California, that upper crust accent of hers only got deeper. She never sounded like a Californian. And she would use the accent to seem different from other people, to draw attention to herself. She used it as a civil rights organizer. She knew it made her stand out. But if it was a case of really using her privilege to obtain favors of any kind that somebody else couldn't have, she usually didn't. And the sad truth about Julia's death was that it was part of Jessica Mitford trying not to take advantage of her background.
So That's the first tragedy of her young life. The second tragedy is the loss of Esmond.
Yep.
In the war. He was shot down, in the war over what sea? Was it the North Sea?
Over the North Sea, yeah.
Yeah. And so, and you described him. He was this kind of indomitable figure. It's this kind of classic story of the quote unquote invincible young man who sort of doesn't maybe recognize his own vulnerabilities or thinks of himself as being invincible. You don't think at that age that it's ever going to happen to you. And then he goes off to fight in this war after he survived all of these harrowing battles in the Spanish Civil War. And I want to say on like day one.
Yeah, it's really close to day one. It's probably like month 2, but it's really close to day one. He's shot and killed over the North Sea. And Esmond, like Decca, he did not have to fight in that war. They were living in the United States at the time. He volunteered. He was not recruited. He volunteered with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He wanted to fight the fascists, just like he didn't have to fight in Spain. That was something he really wanted to do. It was hard for him to get to Spain. He actually bicycled 7 days across the Pyrenees to get there. And yes, he didn't believe he would be killed. He had that kind of almost Peter Pan quality of I will live forever that came both out of his class, but was really deep in his particular makeup. But at the same time, he put himself on the line, both in Spain and then in the war, and was killed very quickly, leaving her alone in the United States with an infant daughter, cut off from her family, no training, no job skills, no money, and no family or close connections in the United States. And she's in her early 20s and completely on her own.
So I think there's a line in the book, pivots were her superpower. I don't know if that's in the book or in an interview that I read.
No, that's something I wrote in the book, that pivots were her superpower.
And this is maybe the first time that we really see it in evidence because the chips are down. I mean, she's been through dual tragedies, has essentially lost her whole family. And now she's in the United States. She's got to reinvent herself.
Yep.
She's dealing with grief that, I don't know if it's the healthiest way to process grief, this British aristocratic way of basically just kind of like shutting it off and pretending like it didn't happen or just dealing with it very, very privately. So I think as an outgrowth of this grief that she's feeling, but yet not really feeling, she throws herself into political causes and starts working for, I believe, the Office of Price Administration.
Yeah.
So what is that?
So her life is a combination of choices and luck. And Esmond was a really remarkable choice for her because he was a great model of sort of aristocratic rebellion. But then she has the bad luck, right? Her luck is sometimes good and sometimes horrible, of his death and Julia's death. But simultaneously, she has the good luck of being ensconced at that moment in the household of Clifford and Virginia Durr. And that was Esmond's doing. When he signed up with the Royal Canadian Air Force, he actually talked the Durrs into taking her in, not knowing that she would end up completely alone, not knowing that he would die, but he put her in exactly the right household for her. Because the Durrs, living in Washington, D.C., working for the government, were renowned civil rights figures. And Virginia Durr had come from what is essentially the Southern aristocracy. Virginia Durr was roughly 15 years older than Decca, so she could be a kind of older sister figure to her. Virginia Durr was very soft-hearted, but Virginia Durr was a steely political activist who had been spending years at that point fighting the poll tax. And the poll tax is something that a lot of your listeners maybe aren't that familiar with. They should probably get familiar with it because there's a lot of talk about bringing it back. It's part of Project 2025. They don't call it the poll tax, but there are versions of anti-voting rights measures that are very like that. And the poll tax was a way of keeping Black people from voting in the South. And it had been extremely effective in the South, so that you had all kinds of Southern counties where the Black population was 70%, but there were only 4 Black voters. And that was all due to the poll tax, to these restrictive measures around who could vote. And Virginia Durr, product of the white Southern aristocracy, had been remarkably effective in a battle against the poll tax for years when Jessica Mitford met her. And Clifford Durr was already working in the government. He was already part of the New Deal administration. And Jessica Mitford, with no job skills and no background, got herself a job in the Office of Price Administration in Washington. And this was a great land for her. The Office of Price Administration was a wartime agency that was designed to ensure that industries and companies were not taking advantage of the war to price gouge consumers. So it was really an early version of consumer protection kinds of agencies. And it monitored everything from price gouging to gasoline rationing. And Jessica Mitford got an early job in the OPA, and she was supposed to be in the secretarial pool, but she had absolutely no clerical skills of any kind. So she actually got other people through a series of subterfuges to do her typing for her. And she quickly got promoted to an investigative position. And thank goodness she did, because she found out what a brilliant investigator she was. And her unspoken motto as an investigator was, by any means necessary. So if her job was to find the truth about something, she was going to find the truth about something come hell or high water. And her job as an OPA investigator involved everything from going into businesses and pretending to be a customer of those businesses to find out what they were charging, to doing stakeouts of high-level people to make sure they weren't doing pleasure driving and wasting gasoline. And she proved herself to be an exceptional investigator who was remarkably zealous for finding out anybody who was breaking the rules. And what's so funny about that is that Jessica Mitford has a lifelong complete inability to follow rules. She can't do it. It's just anathema to her. She's unable to follow a rule, but she is a brilliant rule enforcer for everybody else. So it's pretty funny first job.
She's an interesting figure in the way that she was able to reinvent herself and to demonstrate resilience again and again, and to win people to her favor. She had an excellent capacity for making social connection and building friendships and charming people with this accent. I mean, you can imagine in these realms that she was operating in, that she was an oddity, you know, a woman of the British aristocracy who was hanging out in a, you know, this is another aspect of the whole thing that's interesting to me, is that all of these traitors to their class kind of found each other. I guess it wasn't a huge group. But you talk about Virginia Durr being a woman from the South who was, you know, dedicating her life to civil rights and fighting the poll tax. You know, not a lot of Southern belles, you know, took that path. And so it's both interesting and fortuitous that Decca and Virginia Durr found each other, that Decca found Esmond, you know, and took up with him. I mean, it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. But, you know, there's an aspect of her upbringing and this privilege that she was born into that I think is a piece of the puzzle. I don't think it's the whole puzzle, but she had this kind of confidence. I don't think there's a room that she walked into in her whole life that she ever felt out of place in. And I think that kind of comes from being hyper-privileged. Do you agree? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, she could walk into a room with like heads of state and not be kind of cowed by it. And yet she also had the capacity to be in rooms with, you know, civil rights attorneys or people who were victims of, you know, civil rights violations, you know, up and down the social strata. She felt at home, and she had this kind of native confidence.
And I do think it is both a factor of her class and all her sisters had it. So her sisters had no trouble saying as young girls, I'm going to be a duchess, or deciding, oh, Hitler should notice me, right? I mean, they all had this kind of absolute confidence that they should be noticed and should have impact. And Decca carries that forward from her background. So it's, on the one hand, it is a factor of her privileged upbringing, but it is also Decca being Decca. So she had this to an extraordinary degree, and she had an ability to follow through on her commitments with a kind of bravery and courage and confidence that really was remarkable, because she suffered tragedy after tragedy, almost never asked for help, kept pivoting and finding a way forward. And after she finds herself alone in America during war, she not only becomes a really notable investigator for the OPA, she immediately draws attention to her job skills, but she meets and falls in love with her second husband, Robert Truhaft, a progressive Jewish of Hungarian extraction attorney who's also working at the OPA. And she manages to start an entirely new life with Bob Truhaft, and then to move with him to Oakland, California, and to start a new life. They join the Communist Party. She becomes an unbelievably effective civil rights advocate through the Civil Rights Congress of the American Communist Party. And every few months, the party promotes her to a new and higher position because she just keeps demonstrating her skills. And she keeps managing in all of these different spheres that could hardly be more different from one another to have people notice how skilled she is, how incredibly adept and able she is. And she knows that. She knows she's really able. I think the only time she actually surprises herself is with the phenomenal success of her writing career. When she becomes a wildly successful writer in the 1960s, I think it's the only time that she is successful beyond her own expectations.
Well, and she's what, in her 40s when this pivot happens, right? She becomes
Yeah. I mean, it's absolutely remarkable. She has the phenomenal sort of pivot of her life in midlife at a time when she doesn't expect it and nobody would expect it. Her success at that point had been a 20-year success as an activist. And I don't think she is surprised that she can be so successful as an activist. She believes at that point that she can advocate for people who are very different from her. I think other people are surprised that somebody from the British aristocracy could become such an integral part of the Black Oakland militant community. I don't think she's surprised by that. But when she bursts onto the public scene as a wildly successful writer, after her first memoir and with her breakout book, The American Way of Death, I think even she is finally surprised.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, it makes a lot of sense with the benefit of hindsight. You think of her in the aggregate, all these different skills that she has, in particular, this investigative skill, and that she's obviously got this facility with language, this ability to charm. She made money and had great success lecturing and traveling the country and doing book events. I mean, she was public facing in a way that was greatly to her benefit. And so that was a piece of it as well. But, I think there's a quote that I underlined. She had an appetite for tracking and destroying the enemy. It was this particular kind of writing, when she turned to reportage, that I think it was the thing that allowed her to kind of concentrate all of her greatest strengths into one job. And she also met the right people. I mean, she worked with Bob Gottlieb, and she kind of had some good fortune in terms of who she collaborated with and who helped her bring these books to the world.
And again, it was that mix of choices and luck, sometimes bad and sometimes good. And she was always able to turn good luck to really great advantage. It was another one of her superpowers. But muckraking was made for Jessica Mitford. I mean, the funny thing about her is she sure wasn't born to muckrake. But when she discovered that genre of writing, and she's responsible for reviving it. So muckraking, when she falls into doing muckraking work in the early 1960s, basically nobody is muckraking. So muckraking is an incredibly important American genre at the turn of the last century, but it is not really important at all in the early 1960s. And she paves the way for all the new journalists. She paves the way, of course, for Ralph Nader and Barbara Ehrenreich and all the muckrakers who come after her. And people forget that in 1963, when she publishes her great muckraking book, the other book that shared the bestseller lists with Jessica Mitford, never above her, ironically, was Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring. So the two of them together revived this whole genre of muckraking. And it's perfect for Jessica Mitford because it allows her to defend the underdog, and she's a great defender of the underdog, and to be funny. And the thing about The American Way of Death that is so brilliant is it's on the one hand a book about this morbid, grisly subject of death, and at the same time it is hold your gut and laugh out loud funny. And that's its brilliance, is bringing those two things together.
It was about the corruption of the funeral industry in the United States and the way that the dead were treated and the way that these companies and these bad actors would profit off them to excess, essentially.
Exactly. And it actually came to her from her husband, Bob. So Bob was a lawyer, and he was the counsel for the Bay Area Memorial Society, which was a co-op of folks in the Bay Area who were trying to get around expensive funerals by doing DIY funerals even then. And he would come home with these stories from his work with Bay Area Memorial Society. And Jessica Mitford would wave them off as, that's your funeral thing. I'm not interested. I don't want to hear about it. This is boring. But one day he came home with a story that she absolutely loved. So he had a client who was a widow of somebody who was in the labor unions. Almost all the people he worked with were union people. And what he had noticed time and time again was that the undertakers always seemed to know exactly what the union death benefit amounted to, so that they could fleece the widow, and it was almost always a widow, not a widower, so they could fleece the widow out of every single cent. They just knew, right, exactly how much to get. And he would come home with these stories of these poor widows. And one day he came home with a story of a widow who had tried to hold back some of that death benefit. She wanted to save a little bit of it to live on, and she was desperately trying to reduce the funeral costs. So she was negotiating with the undertaker for a less expensive casket. And he was trying to place her husband in the most elaborate casket with the mahogany and the copper and the satin and everything. And she was trying to get him to sell her the cheap wooden one. And he said to this poor grieving widow, "Yeah, ma'am, I can put your husband in that cheap casket, but I'll have to cut his feet off to do it."
Jeez.
So Bob comes home with this story, right? And Jessica says, that's it. We have to look into this. We have to write something about this. And first she writes an article, and she expects it to be a little sort of, a little article that maybe the Unitarians pick up on and some progressives in the Bay Area. And as we would now say, it goes viral. The article just attracts a world of attention. And clearly it's a book. Clearly it's a book that needs to be written. But she does not initially have the great luck of working with Bob Gottlieb, legendary Simon & Schuster editor. That only comes to her from bad luck. So Bob and she decide to write this book together. He takes a year off his law firm. It's completely
Bob Truhaft.
Sorry, Bob, her husband.
Yes.
It's a completely co-written book. Every piece of it is 50-50. And they're writing the book together. And the chapter on embalming is particularly detailed and particularly grisly. And they feel that's really important because they want to expose what a sham embalming is. The undertakers would always say it was required by law. It's never been required by law. That was a lie. Right? And they want to expose how grisly the procedure is. And her publisher was Houghton Mifflin. And her editor at Houghton Mifflin was appalled at how grisly and how fascinated with the grisly details she and her husband, Bob Truhaft, are. And they say to she and Bob, you have to take that chapter out or we're going to pull the book. And they say, do it. Pull the book. We'll mimeograph this thing on our dining table. We are not changing a word. And their contract was canceled by Houghton Mifflin. And that was pretty bad luck. But the good luck was Bob Gottlieb was waiting in the wings. He had been looking for a book on the funeral industry. He had been waiting for an expose on the funeral industry. And he already knew about Jessica Mitford. And he grabbed this thing up, gave them twice the money. And it started one of the great author-editor relationships of American letters.
I mean, she was a massive success as a writer. Yeah. She had great publishing success. That book sold, that was her biggest success, The American Way of Death. But I mean, it sold hundreds of thousands of copies, I want to say.
Yes, and it changed funeral law, and it changed John F. Kennedy's funeral, and it put her on every television station, every radio station. She was throwing away speaking gigs with both hands. She couldn't possibly keep up. She was a major celebrity. She topped the New York Times bestseller list week after week after week.
So we can't get to it all. It's a big life, and you cover it beautifully in this book. I do want to at least touch on the fact that she was close friends with Maya Angelou. That was probably her strongest literary friendship.
Yes.
They were kind of like running buddies as writers, and I think they pushed and encouraged one another, but they just had a very close friendship. Can you talk a little bit about Decca and Maya's relationship?
It was such an important relationship for them both. For Decca, it gave her some of what she had always missed and longed for in that tribe of sisters who never recognized her California life, who could never see how fulfilling and right for her choices had been, whether her marriage choices or her life as an activist and a communist or her life as a muckraker. But Maya saw her. Maya really recognized every piece of the life Decca had built for herself out of nothing. And they called each other sisters. And whenever they introduced one another to new people, they said with deadpan seriousness, "This is my sister," and they refused to explain. And they loved the fact that Maya was Black and Decca was British aristocrat white, and they refused to explain how they could be related, but they really were sisters to one another. And it was Maya who encouraged Decca to be very professional as a writer, to insist on good contracts, to insist on good kill clauses, to insist on decent hotel rooms. Maya was absolutely unapologetic about wanting to be treated with success as a writer. She had earned that. She had taught herself everything about having a writing career. And she very much encouraged Decca in those ways. And they constantly buoyed each other up so that when they finally had a falling out, which they finally did, it was a very difficult falling out. It was very, very difficult for Decca, and it was very painful.
I guess the last question I want to ask you is about yourself. Having spent so much time, you said it took you 10 years. You did 10 years of research and writing that went into this book. You've spent a lot of time with this family and with Decca in particular. And I have to imagine have internalized lessons from her life and her career, since you yourself are obviously a writer. But can you just talk a little bit about the impact that this work has had on you? Like, what did you take away from this project personally?
She has actually had a tremendous impact on me. I don't think you can spend 10 years as a biographer with somebody and not become deeply impacted by their way of life and their attitude. I will never have Decca's concrete upper lip. I am a true American Jewish feminist who talks about herself and talks about her feelings Decca had an expression for that. She called it grubbing about, and she wanted no part of it. She didn't want to talk about herself or her feelings. And I will always grub about. I am never going to change in that way. But I do take away from Decca the importance of not giving in to the luxury and the privilege of political despair. She spent all her life fighting authoritarianism and fighting fascism. And she lived through times that are even worse than what we're going through. And she also lived through personal tragedy alongside those difficult times. She lived through the Spanish Civil War. She lived through the global turn to fascism. She lived through the Second World War and loss. And she lived through the HUAC years. She lived through the Red Scare. And she lost many friends to suicide, to family breakup, to leaving the United States, to terrible depression from which people never recovered. I think some of your listeners may not know how much damage to people's lives the Red Scare did. Many, many people never recovered from it. Decca and her husband Bob did recover, but the people around them often did not. She lived through all of that, and she kept up the fight by keeping up her spirits. And as I face the news every morning and I feel horrific despair, whether it's over what Kennedy has now done to trans people and my students who are trans and my friends who are trans, and the denial of healthcare or the denial of healthcare to women, or are you kidding me? We're going to go to war with Venezuela. What are you talking about? I realize I cannot give in to despair. That the only way we're going to keep up this fight, because it's not going to be over in a month. We are in this now for the long haul, is by following Decca's model and keeping up our spirits. And to me, as somebody who could lean into despair a little bit right now, she's offered me a really important model that I have a responsibility to other people to keep my spirits up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I took away from it as well. And also, it's a wonderful book and a wonderful life story for anybody who's of a certain age wondering, like, is there another act for me? Mm-hmm. She never stopped reinventing herself until the end. And I think had this kind of optimism that it was always possible. Something else good could always be around the corner. It might not necessarily be there exactly when she expected it, but she never lost the belief that it could be. And she had an enormous capacity for work and I guess maybe a self-belief, but it's a very inspiring book on that level.
And 2 years before her death, if I can just throw one example at your listeners, she actually formed a rock and kazoo band called Decca and the Decktones and recorded an album, which mostly had Beatles songs and Old English ballads. So she was constantly reinventing herself and refusing to accept that there wasn't a next act for herself. She always thought there was a next act, and that's how she lived.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I'm really glad that I read it. It was a gap in my historical and cultural knowledge, and it's kind of a perfect book for its time, for people like you and like me who kind of get up every morning and sort of gird themselves before they open the internet to look at the news. I mean, her life and the example that she set is useful in these times. And I appreciate your time in talking with me about all of it. And I congratulate you on the success that this book is having. I always end by asking my guests if they're working on anything else. Considering, the amount of time you spent on this one, that might be like a sore spot. I don't mean you might just be like, Jesus, I just finished this one. But is there another project in the works, or are you just celebrating the publication of The Troublemaker?
There are two smaller, I hope, books on Zora Neale Hurston in the works. And then we will see. I have a couple things I'm not quite ready to talk about yet, and which I'm having to keep from my husband, because if he believed there was something of this scope in the works right now, I would be living alone.
Well, I wish you well, and I thank you again for the time.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, there we have it. That was my conversation with Carla Kaplan about Decca Mitford and this new book of hers called Troublemaker. The Fierce, Unruly Life of Jessica Mitford, available now from Harper Books. You can learn more at carlakaplan.com. You can follow Carla on Facebook and Blue Sky, and you should read her book. Again, it's called Troublemaker. It's out there now. It's long-listed for major awards. It's an excellent biography of a very fascinating and consequential 20th century writer. So check it out. And don't forget to subscribe to this show if you haven't done that yet. Hit the subscribe button. Follow me on Blue Sky and Instagram. Sign up for my newsletter at bradlisti.substack.com. If you love this show, if you're in the holiday spirit, if you listen regularly, you can support this show and the work that I do over at patreon.com/otherpplpod. I'd be grateful if you did that. If you want to join my book club, the Other People Book Club, or if you want to get a t-shirt or a sweatshirt, you can do that at otherppl.com, the show's official website. If you want to get some deep dive courses, you can do that at deepdive.audio. Save 30% through Christmas Day. Use the code HOLIDAYS2025. And if you want to send a gift, just select Send as a Gift at checkout. You'll see it, and you can schedule delivery anytime. Last but not least, if you have it in your heart to help me out, I would be super grateful if you would rate and review this program wherever you listen. So if you're on Apple Podcasts, for example, there's a way to kind of rate the show. You can give it 5 stars. That would be nice. You can write a little review, preferably a glowing review. It helps the show in the algorithm, and it helps it find new listeners. All right? So I think that's it for today. We're all done. And I should be back on Tuesday with another episode. I will be wrapping things up. Maybe it might just be me talking. I'll run down, a list of the year's most popular episodes, and then I'll be airing some reruns. I'll be kind of like looking back on the year, airing some reruns over the closing days of 2025. Right? Good riddance. Hopefully brighter days in 2026, right? Please? Pretty please? Okay, I'll talk to you soon. Stay tuned.